My name is Emma Rodriguez. I'm 29 years old, and 18 months ago I was fielding frantic work calls while howler monkeys screamed in the Costa Rican rainforest behind me. Today I'm signing the acquisition papers to buy the company that destroyed my honeymoon. Sometimes karma works faster than you think. The moment that changed everything happened at 4:47 AM Costa Rica time when my phone rang in our jungle lodge. My new husband Danny was sound asleep beside me, exhausted from our zip-lining adventure the day before. I should have let it go to voicemail. Instead, I whispered hello and heard Rick Thompson's voice demanding I fix a client crisis that supposedly couldn't wait another second. What I didn't know then was that Rick had orchestrated the entire emergency just to prove he owned me, even on my honeymoon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The foundation of my story begins 3 years before that devastating phone call when I first walked through the glass doors of Summit Strategic Solutions in downtown Portland. I was fresh out of graduate school with my MBA in operations management, carrying a worn leather portfolio and enough ambition to power the entire Pearl District. The company occupied 2 floors of a sleek building overlooking the Willamette River, and I remember thinking this was exactly where I wanted to build my career. Summit Strategic Solutions specialized in helping businesses streamline their operations, and they were good at what they did. Really good. Patricia Williams had founded the company 15 years earlier after leaving a corporate consulting giant, and she'd built something special. The office buzzed with an energy I'd never experienced before. Project managers moved between glass-walled conference rooms, consultants hunched over laptops developing efficiency protocols, and everywhere you looked, people seemed genuinely excited about solving complex business problems. I started as a junior project coordinator, which basically meant I was everyone's assistant with a fancier title. My days were spent organizing client files, scheduling meetings, taking notes, and desperately trying to prove I belonged in those conference rooms. But I loved every minute of it. There's something addictive about diving into a struggling company's operations and finding the inefficiencies that are bleeding money and morale. It's like solving a massive puzzle where the pieces are people, processes, and profit margins. Within 6 months, I'd been promoted to project coordinator, and within a year, I was managing my own client accounts. My specialty became change management, helping companies not just identify problems but actually implement solutions in ways their employees could embrace. I had a knack for reading people, understanding what motivated different personality types, and designing transition plans that felt collaborative rather than imposed. My first major success was with Northwest Manufacturing Corp., a family-owned business that had been operating the same way for 40 years. They were hemorrhaging money due to outdated inventory systems and communication breakdowns between departments. The previous consultant had recommended a complete digital overhaul that would have cost them $500,000 and required laying off longtime employees. Instead, I spent 3 weeks shadowing workers, understanding their workflows, and identifying simple process improvements that required minimal technology investment. The solution I proposed saved them $300,000 annually while keeping their entire workforce intact. More importantly, the employees felt heard and valued throughout the process. The company owner, Frank Northwest, called Patricia personally to praise the work, and suddenly I wasn't just another coordinator. I was the person clients specifically requested for their most sensitive projects. That's when I first encountered Rick Thompson. He'd been hired as operations director 6 months before my promotion, brought in from a larger consulting firm in Seattle with promises of scaling Summit's business model. Rick was everything I initially thought I wanted: to become confident, well-dressed, articulate in client meetings, and seemingly respected by everyone who mattered. He had this way of walking into a room and immediately commanding attention, his silver hair perfectly styled and his handshake firm enough to crack knuckles. At first, Rick seemed genuinely interested in mentoring me. He'd stop by my desk to ask about my projects, invite me to sit in on high-level strategy meetings, and occasionally take me to lunch at expensive restaurants downtown where he'd share war stories from his corporate consulting days. I felt chosen, special, like I was being groomed for bigger things within the company. The subtle manipulation started so gradually I didn't recognize it for what it was. Rick would ask me to stay late to help with proposals, claiming my fresh perspective was invaluable. He'd assign me additional responsibilities that weren't technically part of my job description, explaining that versatility was essential for advancement. When clients praised my work, Rick would smile and say things like, "Emma's really coming along under my guidance," as if my successes were somehow his achievements. I told myself I was lucky to have such an invested mentor. Rick was teaching me the business, exposing me to opportunities I never would have had otherwise. When he started expecting me to answer emails during weekends, I convinced myself it was normal for ambitious professionals. When he began calling during my vacation days with quick questions that turned into hour-long strategy sessions, I felt important rather than exploited. The pattern escalated slowly but relentlessly. Rick had this genius for making his unreasonable demands seem like opportunities. "Emma, I know it's your day off, but the green tech client specifically asked for you to review these projections. You've built such a strong relationship with them. Who could argue with that logic?" I was building relationships. I was becoming indispensable. I was advancing my career. My personal life began suffering in ways that felt normal for someone climbing the corporate ladder. I canceled dinner plans with friends because Rick needed help preparing for Monday morning presentations. I spent Sunday afternoons at coffee shops working on project proposals instead of hiking with Danny, whom I'd been dating for 2 years. I rationalized every sacrifice as temporary, telling myself that once I proved my worth and secured a promotion, the balance would improve. Danny, bless his heart, tried to be understanding. As an elementary school teacher, he lived in a world with clear boundaries. School ended at 3:30, and except for occasional parent conferences or school events, his evenings and weekends belonged to him. He'd watch me frantically typing responses to Rick's late-night emails and gently suggest that maybe some things could wait until Monday. I'd explain about client deadlines and competitive advantages, using corporate buzzwords to justify what I was beginning to suspect was simply poor management. The dynamic at Summit Strategic Solutions was intoxicating in its dysfunction. Patricia Williams, the founder, had gradually stepped back from day-to-day operations as the company.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Grew. She trusted Rick to handle the operational details while she focused on strategic partnerships and business development. This meant Rick had enormous latitude in how he managed the consulting teams, and he wielded that power with the subtlety of a master manipulator. Rick had perfected the art of creating artificial urgency. Every project became a crisis requiring immediate attention. Every client request transformed into a potential disaster that only his team could prevent. He'd schedule emergency meetings on Friday afternoons that ran until 7 p.m., then express disappointment when team members seemed reluctant to sacrifice their weekend plans for the good of the company. What made Rick's manipulation particularly effective was his ability to single out high performers and make them feel indispensable. He'd praise our dedication in team meetings, highlighting how our extra efforts had saved important client relationships. The recognition felt addictive, especially for someone like me who'd grown up as the youngest daughter in a family of overachievers. I craved that validation, that sense of being seen as exceptional. My colleagues and I would commiserate about Rick's demanding schedule, but we'd do it in whispers during coffee breaks, afraid our complaints might be interpreted as lack of commitment. There was an unspoken understanding that Rick's approval was essential for advancement within the company. He controlled project assignments, performance reviews, and recommendations for promotion. Cross Rick, and you'd find yourself stuck on tedious administrative tasks while watching other consultants handle the prestigious client accounts. The breaking point in this toxic dynamic came during my second year at Summit, when I landed the biggest client account in company history. Green Tech Innovations was a renewable energy startup that had received massive funding to expand their operations across the Pacific Northwest. They needed help scaling their organizational structure while maintaining their innovative culture, and their CEO had specifically requested Summit based on my work with Northwest Manufacturing. The Green Tech project was everything I'd dreamed of as a business consultant. The company was growing from 50 employees to over 200 in 18 months, opening new offices in Seattle and Sacramento while maintaining their Portland headquarters. They needed comprehensive change management across every department: human resources, operations, finance, sales, and engineering. The contract was worth nearly $400,000, more than some consulting firms made in entire quarters. I threw myself into the Green Tech project with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I spent weeks interviewing employees at every level, understanding their concerns about rapid growth and their hopes for the company's future. I developed detailed transition plans for each department, created training programs for new managers, and designed communication strategies to keep employees informed and engaged throughout the expansion process. The work was exhausting but exhilarating. I'd arrive at the office by 7 a.m. and rarely leave before 9 p.m., sustained by takeout dinners and the adrenaline rush of solving complex organizational puzzles. Danny would text me photos of the dinners he'd cooked for himself, adding little heart emojis that made me feel guilty but not guilty enough to change my behavior. Rick, meanwhile, positioned himself as the mastermind behind the green tech success. In client meetings, he'd present my strategies as collaborative efforts, using phrases like "our team developed this approach," and "we identified these opportunities." When Green Tech's CEO praised the innovative solutions, Rick would smile and accept the credit while I sat silently, telling myself that team success was more important than individual recognition. The Green Tech project's success led to 3 additional client contracts, each one larger and more complex than the last. Pacific Retail Solutions wanted help optimizing their supply chain across 47 store locations. Cascade Financial Group needed assistance restructuring their investment advisory services to comply with new federal regulations. Morrison Tech, a software development company, required guidance scaling their agile development processes to accommodate rapid growth. Each project followed the same pattern. I develop innovative solutions working nights and weekends. Rick would present the strategies as his own brilliance, and clients would praise Summit for their exceptional consulting expertise. My reputation within the Portland business community grew, but so did Rick's control over my professional life. He'd volunteer my services for additional client work without consulting me, promising quick turnarounds that required sacrificing any pretense of work-life balance. The personal cost of this professional success became increasingly difficult to ignore. I'd missed Danny's birthday dinner because Rick scheduled an emergency client call. I'd skipped my sister Sophia's graduation party because Rick needed help preparing a presentation for a potential new client. I'd canceled vacation plans twice because Rick claimed my clients couldn't function without my direct oversight. Danny, with the patience of someone who spends his days managing 8-year-olds, tried repeatedly to address my work obsession. He'd suggest we plan a weekend getaway, where I'd promise to turn off my phone, only to spend Saturday morning responding to Rick's texts about urgent client requests. He'd cook elaborate dinners as romantic gestures, only to watch me eat while reviewing project timelines on my laptop. The conversation that changed everything happened on a rainy Thursday evening in February. Danny had prepared my favorite meal, Chilean, sea bass with roasted vegetables, and lit candles around our small dining table. I'd promised to be home by 6:30, but Rick had called another last-minute team meeting that ran until nearly 8 p.m. I arrived home to find Danny sitting alone at the table, the candles burned down to stubs and the fish cold on the plate. "Emma, we need to talk," he said quietly, and something in his tone made me finally put down my phone. "I love you and I want to marry you, but I can't compete with Rick Thompson for your attention anymore. You're disappearing into that job, and I'm watching the woman I fell in love with become someone I barely recognize." The words hit me like ice water. Danny wasn't being dramatic or unreasonable, he was stating facts. I had become someone I barely recognized, someone whose entire identity was wrapped up in work achievements and Rick's approval. I'd sacrificed my relationships, my health, and my happiness for the illusion of professional success. That night, lying in bed while Danny slept beside me, I made a decision that would ultimately change everything. I was going to set boundaries. I was going to reclaim my life. And I was going to do it gradually, strategically, in ways that wouldn't jeopardize my career, but would protect my personal relationships. The first boundary I set was simple: no work emails after 9 p.m. or before 7 a.m. Rick tested this limit immediately, sending urgent requests at 10:30 p.m. and acting surprised when I didn't respond until the following morning. When he asked about my delayed response, I calmly explained that I was implementing better time management practices to improve my effectiveness during business hours. The second boundary was weekend work. I informed Rick that I would no longer be available for non-emergency client work on Saturdays and Sundays, though I remained flexible for genuine crises. Rick's definition of emergency was creative, but I held firm. When he called on Saturday morning claiming a client was threatening to cancel their contract, I calmly suggested he handle the situation himself or wait until Monday, when I could properly investigate the issue. These small acts of rebellion felt terrifying at first. I'd spent 2 years conditioning myself to be available whenever Rick demanded, and establishing boundaries felt like professional suicide. But something remarkable happened: the quality of my work improved. When I wasn't constantly exhausted from late-night emails and weekend projects, I brought more creativity and strategic thinking to my client accounts. My relationship with Danny transformed almost immediately. We started cooking together on Sunday afternoons, exploring Portland's hiking trails on Saturday mornings, and having actual conversations about our hopes and dreams, rather than my work frustrations. In March, he proposed during a weekend trip to Cannon Beach, presenting a simple but elegant ring, while waves crashed behind us. The engagement announcement created an interesting dynamic at Summit Strategic Solutions. Patricia Williams, the company founder, was genuinely excited and asked about our wedding plans with the warmth of a favorite aunt. My colleagues threw an impromptu celebration in the office break room, complete with champagne and a cake from our favorite bakery downtown. Rick's reaction was more complex. He congratulated me publicly with appropriate enthusiasm, but I detected something else in his expression. Resentment perhaps, or calculation. It was as if my engagement represented a threat to his control, a competing loyalty that might interfere with my absolute dedication to the job. Over the following months, as Danny and I planned our September wedding, Rick's behavior became increasingly erratic. He'd assign me additional responsibilities without warning, claiming my other projects weren't sufficiently challenging. He'd schedule client meetings during times he knew I had wedding-related appointments, then express disappointment when I had to reschedule. The most troubling incident occurred in July, 3 months before our wedding date. Green Tech Innovations had invited me to speak at a renewable energy conference in San Francisco about organizational change management. It was a tremendous professional opportunity, the kind of visibility that could launch consulting careers. The conference was scheduled for a Thursday and Friday, requiring me to take 2 days off from regular client work. I'd cleared the conference attendance with Rick weeks in advance, but on the Wednesday before my departure, he called an emergency meeting about a supposedly critical issue with the Pacific Retail Solutions account. The meeting ran until after 8 p.m., and Rick expressed concerns about my ability to handle both the conference presentation and the client crisis simultaneously. "Maybe you should skip the conference," Rick suggested with feigned concern. "Pacific Retail is threatening to review their contract terms, and you know how volatile that relationship can be. I'd hate for something to fall through the cracks while you're networking in San Francisco." For the first time in our professional relationship, I looked Rick directly in the eye and said no. I explained that the Pacific Retail issue wasn't urgent, that my conference presentation had been scheduled for months, and that I wouldn't be canceling professional commitments based on manufactured emergencies. Rick's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and angry beneath his polished exterior. Then he smiled and said of course I should honor my conference commitment, though he hoped I understood the sacrifices required for advancement in competitive industries. The San Francisco conference was a revelation. Speaking to an audience of business leaders about sustainable organizational growth, I felt a confidence and passion that had been missing from my work for months. During the networking sessions, other consultants shared stories about their firm's approaches to work-life balance, and I realized how abnormal Rick's management style truly was. One conversation particularly stood out. Jennifer Morrison, a principal at a Berkeley-based consulting firm, mentioned that her company had a strict policy against contacting employees during approved vacation time. "We found that people return from actual rest more creative and productive," she explained. "Burnout is expensive for everyone involved." The concept seemed revolutionary. A consulting firm that actually encouraged work-life balance. That trusted employees to manage their own time and priorities. That measured success by results rather than hours logged. Jennifer gave me her business card and suggested I call if I ever wanted to discuss opportunities in the Bay Area. Flying back to Portland, I felt something shifting in my perspective about Summit Strategic Solutions and my place within the company. The conference had reminded me why I'd fallen in love with consulting in the first place: the intellectual challenge of solving complex problems, the satisfaction of helping organizations reach their potential, the thrill of creating strategies that transformed entire business cultures. Rick's version of consulting felt small and petty by comparison. His focus on control and manipulation created an environment where talented people burned out instead of flourishing. His inability to trust his team's judgment meant missing opportunities for innovation and growth. His toxic management style was actively undermining the company's potential. August and September passed in a whirlwind of wedding preparations and final client projects before my 2-week honeymoon. Danny and I had chosen Costa Rica after researching destinations that offered both adventure activities and relaxation opportunities. We'd booked a week at a beach resort in Tamarindo, followed by a week at an eco-lodge in the Manuel Antonio rainforest. The wedding itself was everything we'd dreamed of and more. We held the ceremony at McMenamin's Edgefield, a historic venue in Troutdale with gardens and vineyards that provided a perfect backdrop for our September celebration. Patricia Williams attended with her husband, bringing a generous gift and warm wishes for our future. Even Rick seemed genuinely happy during the reception, dancing with Danny's mother and telling embarrassing stories about my early days at Summit. As Danny and I left for our honeymoon, briefcases packed with sunscreen and adventure gear instead of laptops and client files, I felt lighter than I had in years. I'd left detailed transition notes for my colleagues, confirmed that all urgent projects were completed or properly delegated, and set my email to an out-of-office reply that clearly stated I'd be unavailable until my return. Rick had seemed understanding during our final pre-honeymoon meeting, even suggesting I completely disconnect from work to fully enjoy this special time with Danny. "You've earned this break," he said with what appeared to be genuine sincerity. "Don't worry about anything here. We'll manage perfectly fine without you." I should have known better. I should have recognized the setup, but I was so desperate to believe that Rick had finally learned to respect boundaries that I ignored every warning sign my experience had taught me to recognize. Costa Rica welcomed us with warm tropical air and the intoxicating scent of frangipani flowers. Our resort in Tamarindo sat directly on the beach, with an infinity pool that seemed to blend seamlessly into the Pacific Ocean. Our suite had a private balcony overlooking the water, and we spent our first evening watching the sunset while planning the adventures ahead. For 3 glorious days, I existed in a world where time was measured by meals and sunsets, rather than client deadlines and conference calls. Danny and I went horseback riding along the beach, took a catamaran trip to spot dolphins, and learned to surf from a patient instructor who praised our terrible form with characteristic Costa Rican positivity. On our 4th morning, we'd signed up for a ziplining tour through the rainforest canopy near Manuel Antonio. The adventure involved hiking to various platforms high in the trees, then soaring through the air on cables, while howler monkeys called in the distance, and tropical birds flashed brilliant colors through the green cathedral of leaves. I felt completely present for the first time in years, focused entirely on the physical challenge of navigating the zip lines and the breathtaking beauty of the rainforest around us. Danny took photos of me mid-flight, arms spread wide and face lifted toward the canopy, looking completely free. We returned to our eco-lodge, exhausted but exhilarated, looking forward to a quiet dinner and early bedtime before the next day's wildlife tour. The lodge was a collection of elevated cabins nestled among the trees, designed to blend seamlessly with the natural environment. Our cabin had screens instead of windows, allowing the sounds of the rainforest to filter through, while keeping insects at bay. That night, as howler monkeys provided a soundtrack that would have impressed any horror movie director, I fell into the deepest sleep I'd experienced in months. No alarm clock, no notification sounds, no anxiety about morning meetings or client deadlines. Just the profound rest that comes from complete disconnection from professional obligations. Which made Rick's phone call at 4:47 AM Costa Rica time all the more jarring. The phone's shrill ring cut through the symphony of Costa Rican wildlife like a machete through silk. My eyes snapped open in the darkness of our eco-lodge cabin, disoriented by the unfamiliar sounds and the complete absence of Portland's urban hum. For a moment I couldn't remember where I was, or why howler monkeys were providing what sounded like a horror movie soundtrack outside our screened windows. Danny groaned beside me, his arm tightening protectively around my waist, as if he could somehow shield me from whatever emergency was demanding attention at this ungodly hour. The phone continued its insistent buzzing, the screen's blue light casting eerie shadows across the rustic wooden walls of our cabin. I fumbled for the device, squinting at the caller ID through sleep-blurred eyes. Rick Thompson. Of course it was Rick Thompson. My stomach dropped as reality crashed back into focus. I was supposed to be unreachable, completely disconnected from Summit's strategic solutions and all its manufactured crises. Yet here was my boss, somehow managing to pierce through my carefully constructed vacation bubble, with what was undoubtedly another urgent situation that only I could resolve. Don't answer it, Danny whispered, his voice thick with sleep and something else. Resignation, maybe. He'd witnessed this pattern too many times before, watched me sacrifice personal moments for professional obligations that rarely proved as critical as they initially seemed. But my hand was already swiping to accept the call, muscle memory overriding rational thought. 3 years of conditioning had trained me to respond immediately to Rick's demands, regardless of the hour or circumstances. The Pavlovian response was so deeply ingrained that I couldn't seem to break it, even here in paradise. Emma, thank God you picked up. Rick's voice crackled through the international connection, slightly distorted but unmistakably urgent. In the background I could hear the familiar sounds of the summit office, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, the low murmur of stressed conversations. We have a situation with the Morrison Tech account that's spiraling completely out of control. I sat up slowly, trying to shake off the fog of deep sleep, while my brain attempted to process this intrusion. Morrison Tech was one of my stable accounts, a software development company that had been working with Summit for over a year. Their project involved scaling agile development processes as they expanded from 30 to over 100 employees. It was methodical work, carefully planned and executed, in phases that had been proceeding smoothly for months. What kind of situation? I asked, keeping my voice low to avoid fully waking Dan, though I could feel his body tense beside me as he registered the beginning of another work crisis. Complete meltdown, Rick replied with the dramatic flair
he reserved for maximum impact. Their development teams are in open rebellion against the new project management protocols we implemented. The CEO is threatening to terminate our contract immediately unless we can fix this disaster. Apparently, productivity has dropped 40% since the last phase rollout, and they're blaming our recommendations for destroying their company culture. The accusation hit like a physical blow. I'd spent months developing those protocols, working closely with Morrison Tech's development teams to create processes that would maintain their innovative spirit while providing the structure necessary for larger-scale operations. The developers had been enthusiastic participants in the design process, contributing ideas and feedback that shaped the final recommendations. That doesn't make sense, I said, fully awake now and struggling to understand how a carefully managed transition could have gone so catastrophically wrong. The last progress report showed high satisfaction rates across all departments. The team leads were excited about the productivity improvements they were already seeing. Well, something went terribly wrong after you left, Rick replied, his tone carrying just enough accusation to make me feel responsible for the crisis. Marcus Johnson tried to handle the client meeting yesterday, but he's completely out of his depth with this level of complexity. The Morrison Tech people are furious, claiming we misrepresented our understanding of their development culture. Marcus Johnson was a junior analyst with barely 18 months of consulting experience. He was bright and eager but lacked the deep knowledge of software development processes that the Morrison Tech project required. More importantly, he hadn't been involved in the months of relationship building that had made the project successful. The decision to send Marcus to handle a critical client meeting in my absence was either spectacularly poor judgment or deliberate sabotage. Why did you send Marcus to the meeting? I asked, unable to keep irritation from creeping into my voice. Jennifer Kim has much more experience with tech clients and she's been following the Morrison project from the beginning. There was a pause before Rick responded, the kind of calculated silence that usually preceded his most manipulative explanations. Jennifer's tied up with the Pacific retail crisis, and honestly, Emma, this is exactly the kind of situation where your direct involvement makes the difference between saving the account and losing it entirely. The Morrison CEO specifically asked for you. The familiar guilt began its slow burn in my chest. Rick had perfected the art of making his failures feel like my responsibility, his poor decisions like evidence of my indispensability. The logical part of my brain recognized the manipulation, but the emotional part responded to the implied criticism and the suggestion that my absence was causing real damage to the company. Danny had given up any pretense of sleep and was now sitting up beside me, his expression a mixture of concern and frustration. He'd heard enough of these conversations to recognize the pattern. Rick would present a crisis that required my immediate intervention. I would feel obligated to sacrifice personal time to resolve it, and somehow the emergency would always prove less catastrophic than initially described. What exactly do you need me to do from Costa Rica? I asked, though I already suspected where this conversation was heading. I don't have access to project files and I can't exactly fly back for a client meeting.
Actually, that's exactly what I was hoping you could do, Rick said, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he used when making unreasonable requests sound perfectly logical. The Morrison CEO is willing to meet first thing Monday morning to discuss salvaging the relationship, but only if you're there personally. He's lost confidence in our team's ability to understand their needs. The audacity of the request left me momentarily speechless. Rick was asking me to abandon my honeymoon, fly back from Costa Rica, and clean up a mess that shouldn't have happened in the first place. He was expecting me to prioritize his poor management decisions over my marriage, my mental health, and the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish. Rick, I'm on my honeymoon, I said slowly, as if explaining a complex concept to someone with limited comprehension. I've been gone for 4 days out of a planned 2-week vacation. Surely this can wait until I return, or someone else can handle the client meeting. I understand this is terrible timing, Rick replied with manufactured sympathy, but Morrison Tech represents nearly $200,000 in annual revenue. If we lose this account because we couldn't provide adequate support during a critical transition period, it's going to reflect poorly on everyone involved. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. If the Morrison Tech relationship collapsed, Rick would ensure that responsibility fell squarely on my shoulders. My refusal to cut short my honeymoon would be framed as abandoning the client during their hour of need, evidence that I prioritized personal interests over professional obligations. Danny reached over and gently took my free hand, his touch grounding me in the present moment. Outside our cabin, the rainforest was beginning to wake up with the approaching dawn. Somewhere in the distance, a toucan called out, its exotic cry a stark reminder of how far I was from Portland's corporate pressures. Let me talk to the Morrison CEO directly, I said finally, attempting a compromise that might resolve the situation without requiring my physical presence. I can explain the implementation timeline and address any concerns about the protocol changes. Most client crises stem from communication issues rather than fundamental problems with the work. That's not going to be sufficient, Rick replied quickly as if he'd anticipated this suggestion and prepared his response. Dave Morrison is old school when it comes to business relationships. He wants face-to-face meetings for important decisions, and right now he doesn't trust anyone at Summit except you. Sending someone else or trying to handle this remotely will just confirm his suspicions that we don't take his concerns seriously. I closed my eyes and tried to think clearly through the fog of exhaustion and mounting pressure. Something about Rick's explanation felt off, though I couldn't immediately identify what was bothering me. Dave Morrison, the CEO of Morrison Tech, had always been reasonable and collaborative in our previous interactions. The idea that he would demand my personal intervention after one disappointing meeting seemed inconsistent with his management style. Have you spoken with Dave directly about this? I asked, probing for more details about the supposed crisis. Marcus briefed me extensively after yesterday's disaster, Rick replied smoothly. Dave was very clear about his expectations going forward. He said, and I quote, "If Emma Rodriguez can't be here to fix this mess, then maybe it's time to find a consulting firm that actually supports their recommendations." The quote sounded wrong, somehow too convenient and dramatic to be authentic. Dave Morrison was a soft-spoken engineer, who typically expressed concerns through detailed emails rather than ultimatums delivered in heated meetings. But Rick's certainty and the specific attribution made it difficult to challenge the account without seeming paranoid or defensive. Danny squeezed my hand gently, his silent support helping me focus on what really mattered in this moment. We were supposed to be starting our new life together, creating memories that would last a lifetime. Instead, I was sitting in a rainforest paradise, negotiating with my boss about abandoning my honeymoon to handle a work crisis that might not even be real. I need some time to think about this, I said finally, stalling for space to process the situation without Rick's immediate pressure. Time is exactly what we don't have, Rick replied urgently. The Morrison meeting is scheduled for 9 a.m. Monday morning Portland time. If you're going to make it back, you need to book flights today. Every hour we delay makes this situation worse and reduces our chances of saving the relationship. The artificial deadline was classic Rick Thompson manipulation, creating urgency to prevent careful consideration of alternatives. But the possibility that a major client relationship might genuinely be at risk made it difficult to dismiss his concerns entirely. My reputation at Summit Strategic Solutions was built on successful client outcomes, and the Morrison Tech project had been one of my most visible successes. I'll call you back in 2 hours, I said, ending the conversation before Rick could apply additional pressure.
As I hung up the phone, Danny turned to face me fully, his expression sad but unsurprised. "He wants you to come back, doesn't he?" I nodded miserably, unable to meet his eyes. "There's supposedly a major crisis with one of my biggest clients. The CEO is threatening to terminate our contract unless I personally handle the situation." "On our honeymoon," Danny said quietly, the words carrying the weight of all our previous conversations about work-life balance and my inability to set firm boundaries with Rick. "I know how it sounds," I began, but Danny held up a hand to stop me. "Do you remember what you promised me when I proposed?" he asked gently. "You said you were going to stop letting work control your life. You said our marriage would be the priority, not your job." The memory hit like a physical blow. We'd been walking along Cannon Beach at sunset, the Oregon coast stretching endlessly in both directions, when Danny had dropped to one knee and asked me to spend my life with him. Through tears of joy, I'd promised him that everything would be different, that I'd learn to value our relationship over professional achievements. "This is different," I said weakly, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "This is about my professional reputation. If I let a major client relationship collapse because I refuse to cut short my honeymoon, it could destroy my career." Danny stood up slowly and walked to the cabin's screened window, looking out at the rainforest that was gradually brightening with the approaching dawn. His shoulders were tense with barely controlled frustration, and I could see him struggling to find words that wouldn't escalate the conflict. "Emma, do you hear yourself right now?" he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "You're talking about our honeymoon like it's some frivolous vacation that can be easily rescheduled. This is supposed to be the beginning of our marriage, the most important 2 weeks of our relationship so far." "I'm not saying it's frivolous," I protested, though my actions suggested exactly that interpretation. "I'm just saying that sometimes adult responsibilities require sacrifices." "Adult responsibilities," Danny repeated, turning back to face me. "Like the responsibility to honor your marriage vows. Like the responsibility to maintain the boundaries you promised to establish. Like the responsibility to stop enabling your boss's manipulative behavior." His words stung because they were accurate. Rick's latest crisis followed the exact pattern of every previous emergency: manufactured urgency, appeals to my professional ego, threats to my reputation, and demands for immediate sacrifice of personal time. The only difference was the scale of what he was asking me to give up. "What if it's real this time?" I asked desperately. "What if there really is a crisis that only I can resolve? What if my refusal to help actually destroys the Morrison-Tech relationship?" Danny sat back down on the bed, taking my hands in his and looking directly into my eyes. "Then that's Rick's failure as a manager, not yours as an employee. A competent boss would have contingency plans for situations like this. A healthy company culture wouldn't depend entirely on one person being available 24 hours a day, even during their honeymoon." Logically, I knew Danny was right. Rick's inability to handle client relationships without my constant intervention reflected poor leadership and inadequate systems. A well-managed consulting firm would have multiple team members capable of addressing client concerns, detailed documentation of project decisions, and protocols for handling emergencies during employee absences. But the emotional part of my brain, the part that had been conditioned by 3 years of Rick's manipulation, couldn't let go of the fear that my absence might genuinely cause irreparable damage. What if Marcus had truly mishandled the client meeting? What if the Morrison-Tech CEO really was threatening to terminate the contract? What if my refusal to return immediately cost Summit Strategic Solutions a major account? "I need to make some calls," I said finally, reaching for my phone again. "Let me talk to a few people and get a better understanding of what's actually happening." Danny nodded reluctantly, though I could see him preparing for the inevitable disappointment. He'd been through this pattern enough times to recognize that my fact-finding calls would gradually reveal additional complications that made returning to Portland seem increasingly necessary. My first call was to Jessica Kim, my closest colleague at Summit, and someone I trusted to give me an honest assessment of any crisis. Jessica had been with the company for 5 years, and had worked closely with me on several major projects. If there was a genuine emergency at Morrison-Tech, she would know the details. The call went straight to voicemail, which was unusual for Jessica during business hours. Her outgoing message was professional but brief, offering no hint of the supposed crisis that was consuming the office. I left a message asking her to call me back urgently, and moved on to my next contact. Marcus Johnson answered on the second ring, his voice tense and apologetic. "Emma, I'm so sorry about the Morrison situation. I know Rick called you about coming back, and I feel terrible that my mistake is affecting your honeymoon. What exactly happened in the meeting yesterday? I asked, trying to get specifics about the supposed client meltdown. Marcus sighed heavily before launching into his account. Dave Morrison seemed frustrated from the moment I walked into their conference room. He said the new project management protocols were creating too much bureaucracy and slowing down their development cycles. When I tried to explain the rationale behind the changes, he got more agitated and said he wanted to speak with you directly. The description sounded concerning but not catastrophic. Client pushback on process changes was normal during implementation phases, especially in creative industries like software development. Most concerns could be addressed through minor adjustments and better communication about the benefits of new systems. Did he specifically threaten to terminate the contract? I asked, probing for evidence of the crisis Rick had described. Not in those exact words, Marcus admitted reluctantly. But he was clearly unhappy and mentioned that they might need to reconsider their consulting relationship if the productivity issues continued. The admission confirmed my suspicions. Rick had transformed Marcus's account of normal client concerns into an existential threat requiring my immediate intervention. Dave Morrison's frustration was real, but manageable through standard client relations approaches rather than emergency damage control. Marcus, in your honest opinion, how serious is this situation? I asked directly. There was a long pause before he responded. I think Dave Morrison has legitimate concerns that need to be addressed, but I don't think the relationship is in immediate danger. He seemed more frustrated with the implementation timeline than with the actual recommendations. Relief flooded through me as Marcus's assessment confirmed what my instincts had been telling me. This was not the crisis Rick had described, but rather a routine client management issue that had been dramatically exaggerated to justify interrupting my honeymoon. My next call was to Patricia Williams, Summit's founder and CEO. Patricia rarely involved herself in day-to-day client relationships, but she would definitely know if one of the company's major accounts was threatening to leave. If the Morrison Tech situation was truly as serious as Rick claimed, Patricia would be actively involved in damage control efforts. Emma, dear, how's the honeymoon? Patricia answered warmly, her tone carrying none of the stress or urgency I would expect during a major client crisis. Danny posted some beautiful photos on social media. Costa Rica looks absolutely magical. It's been wonderful, I replied, then hesitated before broaching the business topic. Patricia, I'm sorry to bother you during my vacation, but Rick called about some concerns with the Morrison Tech account. I wanted to check whether you're aware of any serious issues. Patricia sounded genuinely puzzled. I haven't heard anything about problems with that account. Wasn't that project proceeding smoothly under your management? Her response confirmed my growing suspicion that Rick had manufactured the entire crisis. Patricia would certainly know if a major client was threatening to terminate their contract, especially one as visible and profitable as Morrison Tech. Rick said there were some implementation issues that escalated during a client meeting yesterday. I explained carefully, not wanting to directly accuse my boss of lying, but seeking clarification about the situation's severity. That's news to me. Patricia replied thoughtfully. Rick mentioned that Marcus was handling some routine follow-up meetings, but nothing was described as problematic. Are you considering cutting short your honeymoon to address this? Rick suggested it might be necessary. I admitted feeling increasingly foolish about entertaining the idea. Patricia's tone became firm and protective. Emma, you are on your honeymoon. Unless the building is literally on fire, there is nothing at this company that cannot wait 2 weeks for your return. If Rick is suggesting otherwise, then he's overstepping his authority and undermining the work-life balance policies I've tried to establish here. The validation from Summit's founder gave me the confidence I needed to recognize the situation clearly. Rick had lied about the severity of the Morrison Tech concerns, manipulated Marcus's account of the client meeting, and attempted to pressure me into abandoning my honeymoon for a non-existent emergency. Thank you, Patricia, I said gratefully. I needed to hear that from someone with perspective on the bigger picture. Emma, you're one of our most valuable consultants, and that value comes from your strategic thinking and client relationship skills, not from your availability during personal time, Patricia said firmly. Enjoy your honeymoon. Create memories with your husband. The Morrison Tech account will be perfectly fine until you return. After ending the call with Patricia, I sat in the growing daylight of our Costa Rican morning, finally seeing Rick's manipulation with complete clarity. The supposed crisis was a fabrication designed to test my boundaries and reassert his control over my personal time. He'd waited until I was halfway around the world, emotionally vulnerable and geographically isolated, before launching his most audacious attempt yet to prove I belonged to him, rather than to my marriage. Danny had been watching my face during the conversations, and I could see him registering the shift in my expression as the truth became apparent. "It wasn't real, was it?" he asked quietly. "Not even close," I replied, anger beginning to replace the anxiety and guilt that had dominated my emotions since Rick's call. "He completely fabricated the emergency. The client has some routine concerns that can easily be addressed when I return, but Rick decided to frame it as a catastrophic crisis requiring immediate intervention." Danny's expression darkened with fury on my behalf. He tried to destroy our honeymoon with a completely made-up crisis. What kind of person does that? The question hung in the tropical air between us as I contemplated the full implications of Rick's behavior. This wasn't poor judgment or misguided dedication to client service. This was deliberate sabotage of my personal life, a calculated attempt to demonstrate that my professional obligations would always supersede my personal relationships. The kind of person who sees his employees as property rather than human beings. I answered finally, feeling something fundamental shift in my perspective about Summit's strategic solutions and my place within the company. For 3 years I'd told myself that Rick's demanding management style was the price of working for a prestigious consulting firm. I'd rationalized his intrusions into my personal time as evidence of my importance to the company's success. I'd accepted his manipulation as normal corporate culture, something ambitious professionals simply endured on their way to greater achievements. But sitting in a rainforest paradise with my new husband, contemplating the audacity of Rick's latest power play, I finally understood that this had nothing to do with business necessity or professional dedication. This was about control, pure and simple. Rick needed to prove that he owned my time, my attention, and my priorities, even during the most sacred moments of my personal life. "I'm going to call him back," I said, reaching for my phone with renewed determination. "What are you going to tell him?" Danny asked, hope creeping into his voice as he sensed my shifting mindset. "The truth," I replied, dialing Rick's number with steady fingers, "that I see exactly what he's trying to do, and it's not going to work anymore." Rick answered on the first ring, his voice carrying that familiar blend of urgency and manufactured concern that I now recognized as his signature manipulation tactic. "Emma, I was hoping you'd call back quickly. The Morrison situation is deteriorating rapidly, and we really need to move on those flight arrangements." The confidence in his voice, the assumption that I would simply comply with his demands, ignited something fierce and protective in my chest. For 3 years I'd allowed this man to colonize my personal time, to infiltrate my relationships, and to convince me that his poor management was somehow my responsibility. But asking me to abandon my honeymoon based on fabricated emergencies crossed a line I hadn't even known existed. "Rick, I just spoke with Patricia Williams," I said calmly, letting the words settle between us like stones dropped into still water. "She's not aware of any crisis with the Morrison Tech account. In fact, she seemed quite surprised that you would suggest I cut short my honeymoon for what she described as routine implementation concerns." The silence that followed was profound and telling. I could practically hear Rick's mind racing, calculating how to respond to this unexpected development. He'd clearly not anticipated that I would fact-check his story or reach out to Patricia directly. The pause stretched long enough for a toucan to call out from the rainforest canopy, its exotic cry emphasizing the vast distance between my current paradise and Portland's corporate drama. "Well, Patricia doesn't always have visibility into the day-to-day client relationship details," Rick finally replied, his tone shifting subtly from urgent to defensive. "The Morrison situation has developed very quickly, and I may not have had time to brief her fully on the severity of the concerns." The explanation was smooth and plausible, exactly the kind of reasonable-sounding deflection Rick had perfected over years of corporate maneuvering. But I'd also spoken with Marcus Johnson, whose account of the client meeting bore no resemblance to the catastrophic meltdown Rick had described. "I also talked to Marcus," I continued, my voice gaining strength as I watched Danny's face light up with pride and relief. "He confirmed that Dave Morrison had some concerns about implementation timing, but nothing that suggested an imminent contract termination. Certainly nothing that would require emergency intervention from Costa Rica." Another silence, this one edged with something sharper than surprise. When Rick spoke again, his voice carried a coldness I'd never heard before, as if a mask had finally slipped to reveal the calculating predator beneath the polished mentor facade. "Emma, I'm disappointed that you're questioning my professional judgment based on conversations with junior staff members who may not fully grasp the implications of client dissatisfaction," he said slowly. Marcus is barely 18 months out of college. He lacks the experience to recognize when routine concerns might escalate into serious relationship threats. The condescension was breathtaking in its audacity. Rick was simultaneously undermining Marcus's credibility while positioning himself as the only person capable of accurately assessing client situations. It was classic manipulation. Isolate the target from alternative information sources while establishing himself as the sole authority on reality. Marcus may be junior, but he was in the room for the client meeting, I replied steadily. His first-hand account carries more weight than second-hand interpretations, regardless of experience levels. I see, Rick said, and I could hear him recalibrating his approach in real time. It sounds like the time away has given you some perspective on workplace hierarchies and decision-making authority. Perhaps we should schedule a conversation about your role and responsibilities when you return from vacation. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Rick was suggesting that my refusal to comply with his demands might result in professional consequences, a review of my position within the company. It was exactly the kind of intimidation tactic that would have terrified me a week ago. But sitting in paradise with my new husband's hand in mine, it felt pathetic rather than frightening. That sounds like an excellent idea, I replied, surprising him with my agreement. I think it's time we had a very clear conversation about boundaries, expectations, and appropriate management practices. Danny squeezed my hand encouragingly, his eyes shining with admiration as he watched me finally stand up to the man who had been terrorizing my personal life for years. Outside our cabin, the rainforest was fully alive with morning sounds. Birds calling, monkeys chattering, insects humming their complex tropical symphonies. In the meantime, I continued, I'll be completing my honeymoon as planned. If the Morrison tech situation requires immediate attention, I'm confident that someone with your experience and leadership capabilities can handle it appropriately. The deflection back onto Rick's supposed competence was deliberate and pointed. If he truly believed the situation was as critical as he claimed, then his leadership skills should be sufficient to manage it. If he couldn't handle routine client concerns without my intervention, then perhaps his position as operations director needed reconsideration. Emma, I think you're making a serious mistake, Rick said, his voice now carrying open hostility. Your career advancement at Summit Strategic Solutions depends on demonstrating commitment to client success, even when it requires personal sacrifices. My career advancement depends on delivering excellent results for clients, which I've consistently done for 3 years. I corrected
Firmly. It does not depend on being available for manufactured emergencies during my honeymoon. The word manufactured hung in the air like an accusation, which it was. I was no longer pretending to believe Rick's version of events or attempting to preserve his dignity. He had lied to me, manipulated client concerns for personal agenda, and attempted to sabotage the most important personal milestone of my life. I resent the implication that I would manufacture client emergencies, Rick replied coldly. Perhaps your judgment is being clouded by personal considerations rather than professional obligations. My judgment has never been clearer, I said, standing up from the bed and walking to the screened window where the Costa Rican morning was painting the rainforest in brilliant greens and golds. I'll see you when I return from my honeymoon in 10 days. Have a good weekend, Rick. I ended the call before he could respond, my heart racing with a combination of adrenaline and liberation. For the first time in my relationship with Rick Thompson, I had refused his demands, challenged his authority, and prioritized my personal life over his professional manipulation. Danny wrapped his arms around me from behind, his chin resting on my shoulder as we looked out at the awakening rainforest together. I'm so proud of you, he whispered against my ear. That took incredible courage. It took 3 years longer than it should have, I replied, leaning back against his chest and allowing myself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. I can't believe I let him control my life for so long. You were trying to build a career, Danny said gently. There's nothing wrong with being dedicated to your work. The problem was Rick's abuse of that dedication, not your professionalism. We stood together in comfortable silence, watching as the rainforest completed its transition from dawn to full morning. Somewhere in the distance, a family of howler monkeys began their territorial calls, their voices carrying across the canopy like prehistoric echoes. The sounds reminded me that we were thousands of miles away from Portland's corporate pressures, existing in a world where Rick Thompson's opinions and demands held no power. The immediate aftermath of confronting Rick felt surprisingly peaceful. I'd expected anxiety, second-guessing, maybe even panic about potential professional consequences.
Instead, I felt lighter than I had in years, as if I'd finally removed a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. My phone remained mercifully silent for the rest of the morning, as Danny and I prepared for our planned wildlife tour through Manuel Antonio National Park. We'd booked a guided hike with a local naturalist who promised to show us sloths, monkeys, exotic birds, and maybe even the elusive quetzal that Costa Rica was famous for protecting. The tour guide, Carlos, met us at the lodge entrance with infectious enthusiasm and the kind of deep knowledge that comes from a lifetime spent in the rainforest. He was probably 60 years old, weathered by decades of tropical sun, but with bright eyes that missed nothing in the green world around us. Today we will see the rainforest as it truly is, Carlos announced as we set off down a narrow trail that wound through the dense vegetation. Not as tourists looking for photo opportunities, but as guests learning to understand this ecosystem's incredible complexity. As we walked deeper into the forest, Carlos pointed out details I never would have noticed on my own. The intricate relationships between different plant species, the subtle signs that indicated animal activity, the delicate balance that allowed this incredibly diverse ecosystem to thrive. His passion for conservation and education was infectious, and I found myself completely absorbed in learning about this natural world that existed so far from corporate boardrooms and client crises. This tree, Carlos said, stopping beside a massive cecropia that towered above us, is what we call a pioneer species. When the forest is damaged, this tree grows quickly to provide shade and shelter for slower-growing species that will eventually replace it. The cecropia sacrifices its own long-term dominance to help the forest heal. The ecological metaphor struck me with unexpected force. I'd spent 3 years at Summit Strategic Solutions playing the role of pioneer species, growing quickly to provide coverage for risk management failures and creating space for other people's success. But unlike the cecropia tree, my sacrifices hadn't been contributing to some greater ecosystem health. They'd been enabling dysfunction and preventing the organization from developing sustainable leadership practices. The healthiest forests, Carlos continued, apparently unaware of my internal revelations, are those where no single species dominates completely. Diversity creates resilience. When one type of tree or animal becomes too controlling, the entire system becomes vulnerable to collapse. Danny caught my eye and smiled, recognizing that Carlos's ecological wisdom was resonating on multiple levels. The contrast between the rainforest's collaborative complexity and Summit's toxic hierarchy couldn't have been more stark. We spent the next 4 hours exploring hidden trails, observing wildlife, and learning about conservation efforts that protected this incredible biodiversity. I photographed a 3-toed sloth moving with impossible slowness through the canopy, watched a family of white-faced capuchin monkeys play in the trees above us, and caught a glimpse of the brilliant blue morpho butterfly that had become Costa Rica's unofficial symbol. By the time we returned to the lodge for lunch, my phone had accumulated several missed calls and text messages. 3 calls from Rick, 2 from unknown numbers that might have been clients, and a string of increasingly frantic text messages demanding immediate callbacks. "Let me guess," Danny said, noticing my expression as I scrolled through the notifications. "Rick's not handling your boundaries very well." "Apparently not," I replied, showing him the messages. The tone had escalated from professional concern to barely controlled anger to what appeared to be genuine panic about losing control of the situation. The most recent text was particularly revealing. "Emma, your refusal to address the Morrison crisis is putting the entire consulting team's reputation at risk. I've had to escalate this to Patricia's attention, and she's asking difficult questions about your commitment to client service." The threat was clear. Rick was attempting to weaponize Patricia Williams against me, probably by presenting a skewed version of events that portrayed my honeymoon boundary as unprofessional abandonment of client responsibilities. It was exactly the kind of political maneuvering that made corporate environments toxic and productive employees miserable. But Rick had made a critical error in his calculation. Patricia had already expressed strong support for my honeymoon boundaries when I'd spoken with her earlier. She was unlikely to reverse that position based on Rick's manipulation, especially if his account contradicted the information she'd already received directly from me. "Are you going to call him back?" Danny asked, though his tone suggested he already knew my answer. "Not during lunch," I replied, putting my phone in airplane mode and sliding it into my backpack. "In fact, not for the rest of the day. We're on our honeymoon, and I'm done letting Rick Thompson's insecurities interrupt our time together. The decision felt revolutionary. For 3 years, I'd trained myself to respond immediately to Rick's communications, regardless of timing or appropriateness. The idea of deliberately ignoring his calls and messages would have been unthinkable a week ago. Now it felt like a basic act of self-respect. We spent the afternoon exploring the beach near our lodge, swimming in water so warm and clear it felt like liquid silk against our skin. Danny had brought a waterproof camera, and we took turns photographing each other diving through waves and floating in the gentle surf. The photos captured something I hadn't seen in my own face for years: genuine joy, complete presence in the moment, the kind of relaxed happiness that comes from being exactly where you want to be. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, we walked hand in hand along the shoreline. The beach was nearly empty except for a few local families and the occasional surfer catching evening waves. The contrast with Portland's busy urban environment was so complete it felt like visiting another planet. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," Danny said as we sat on a piece of driftwood to watch the sunset. "About Rick controlling your life for 3 years. Do you think he's always been manipulative, or did it escalate gradually?" The question required careful consideration. Looking back with the clarity that distance and perspective provided, I could trace the evolution of Rick's behavior from seemingly supportive mentorship to increasingly invasive control. "It started small," I said finally. "Extra projects that felt like opportunities rather than burdens. Lunch meetings where he shared his corporate wisdom. Late-night emails that made me feel important and included in high-level decisions." Danny nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Classic grooming behavior. Build trust and dependency before introducing the more controlling elements." Exactly. By the time he was calling me during vacations and expecting immediate responses to non-urgent issues, the pattern was so established that it felt normal. I'd been conditioned to see his demands as evidence of my value to the company. "Do you think he's done this with other employees?" Danny asked. The question opened up a line of thinking I hadn't fully explored. Had I been Rick's only target, or was this kind of manipulation standard practice for him? I thought about my colleagues, particularly the other high-performing consultants, who had left Summit Strategic Solutions over the past 2 years. Jennifer Kim, who had transferred to the Seattle office, claiming she needed a change of scenery. David Park, who had taken a position with a competitor, despite having seemed happy and successful at Summit. Sarah Martinez, who had left consulting entirely to join a nonprofit organization, saying she wanted work that felt more meaningful. At the time I'd interpreted these departures as normal career progression, ambitious people seeking new challenges and opportunities. But what if they'd all been fleeing Rick's management style? What if the turnover in Summit's consulting division was higher than normal, because talented people refused to tolerate his manipulative behavior? I think I might have been his primary target because I was willing to tolerate the most abuse, I said slowly. But now that I'm thinking about it, we've lost several excellent consultants over the past couple of years. People who seemed happy with their work but left for vague reasons, like seeking new challenges or better work-life balance. Maybe your refusal to play his games anymore will create space for healthier workplace dynamics. Danny suggested. Sometimes one person standing up to a bully gives others permission to do the same. The idea was appealing but also daunting. If I was right about Rick's pattern of manipulation extending beyond just me, then my confrontation with him might trigger broader changes within Summit Strategic Solutions. Those changes could be positive, creating a healthier work environment for everyone, or they could be professionally dangerous if Rick had more political power than I realized. "Are you worried about the consequences?" Danny asked, reading my expression accurately. "A little," I admitted. "Rick has been with the company longer than me, and he's built relationships with important clients. If this becomes a political battle, I'm not sure I'll win." "But you have Patricia's support," Danny reminded me. "And you have an excellent track record with clients. Plus Rick just demonstrated that he's willing to lie about client crises to manipulate employees. That's not the kind of behavior that reflects well on management capabilities." Danny was right about my advantages in any potential conflict with Rick. My client relationships were strong and independently verifiable. My project outcomes spoke for themselves. Most importantly, Patricia Williams had already expressed disapproval of Rick's attempt to interrupt my honeymoon, which suggested she would be receptive to broader concerns about his management style. As the sun disappeared completely below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in deep purples and navy blues, I felt a sense of resolution settling over me like the tropical evening air. Whatever professional consequences awaited me in Portland, I was done being Rick Thompson's puppet. I was done sacrificing my personal life for his professional insecurities. I was done enabling toxic behavior by pretending it was normal corporate culture. I think I'm going to start looking for other opportunities when we get back, I said quietly, surprising myself with the admission. Danny turned to look at me with interest rather than surprise. Really, you love consulting work? I love the work itself, I clarified, helping companies solve complex problems, developing strategies that improve people's work lives, building relationships with clients who trust my expertise. But I'm starting to think I could do all of that in a healthier environment. With a company that respects boundaries and doesn't manufacture emergencies. Exactly. Or maybe even starting my own practice. I have enough client relationships and industry knowledge to build something independently. The idea of entrepreneurship had been floating in the back of my mind for months, but Rick's constant demands had made it impossible to seriously consider taking such a risk. Now, sitting on a Costa Rican beach with my new husband's support and a clear understanding of what I wouldn't tolerate anymore, the possibility felt exciting rather than terrifying. I think you'd be brilliant at running your own consulting practice, Danny said with conviction. You understand the work better than Rick does, and you actually care about client outcomes rather than just your own power and control. We walked back to our lodge as the tropical darkness settled around us, the sounds of the rainforest providing a soundtrack that was becoming familiar and comforting. Our cabin felt like a sanctuary, screened from the outside world but open to the natural environment surrounding us. I checked my phone briefly before dinner and found 2 more missed calls from Rick, 3 text messages that were increasingly desperate in tone, and 1 email marked urgent in the subject line. Instead of the anxiety these communications would have triggered a week ago, I felt only mild annoyance that Rick was continuing to intrude on my personal time despite clear boundaries. The email's content was particularly revealing. Emma, your lack of response is creating a crisis of confidence among the consulting team. Several team members have expressed concerns about the Morrison Tech situation, and clients are beginning to question our reliability. I need you to call me immediately to discuss damage control strategies. This situation has escalated beyond a simple client concern and is now threatening the company's reputation. Patricia has asked for a full briefing on Monday morning, and I need your input to present an accurate picture of our capabilities. The email was a masterpiece of manipulation, combining threats about team morale, client confidence, and company reputation with an appeal to my loyalty and professional pride. Rick was presenting himself as desperate for my input, while simultaneously suggesting that my absence was causing widespread organizational damage. But reading the message with clear eyes, I could see through every element of the manipulation. Rick was panicking because his fabricated crisis had been exposed, and he was trying to create enough real drama to justify his original lies. The supposed team concerns and client questions were probably as fictional as the original Morrison Tech emergency. More threats? Danny asked, noticing my expression as I read. More desperation, I replied, showing him the email. I think Rick is realizing that his usual tactics aren't working, and he's getting increasingly frantic about losing control. What happens if you just ignore all of this until we get back? Then Rick will have to handle the situation himself, which is what should have happened from the beginning, I said, surprising myself with the confidence in my voice. If there really are client concerns or team morale issues, then that's exactly the kind of management challenge he's paid to address. I deleted the email without responding and put my phone back in airplane mode. Whatever chaos Rick was creating in Portland could wait 10 more days. My honeymoon was too precious to sacrifice for his professional insecurities. That night, as we fell asleep to the sounds of the rainforest, I felt more at peace than I had in years. The confrontation with Rick had been difficult, but it had also been liberating. For the first time since joining Summit Strategic Solutions, I was prioritizing my own well-being over someone else's manipulative demands. The next morning brought a new adventure, a boat trip to explore the coastal mangrove forests, where we would look for wildlife in the intricate root systems that protected the shoreline from erosion. Carlos met us at the marina, with the same infectious enthusiasm he'd brought to our rainforest hike. The mangroves are the nursery of the ocean, he explained as our small boat navigated the narrow channels between the distinctive prop roots that made these trees so remarkable. They provide shelter for young fish, protection for the coastline, and habitat for incredible bird diversity. As we glided silently through the green cathedral of intertwining roots and branches, I was struck by another ecological metaphor that seemed relevant to my professional situation. The mangroves thrived by creating boundaries between the ocean and the land, filtering salt water, and providing protection for vulnerable species during their development. The trees look delicate, Carlos continued, but they are incredibly strong because they work together. No single tree could withstand the storms that regularly hit this coast, but the forest as a whole creates resilience through cooperation. I thought about Summit Strategic Solutions, and the way Rick's management style prevented that kind of cooperative resilience. Instead of building systems that could function effectively without his constant intervention, he'd created a culture of dependency that made the organization vulnerable to his personal limitations and insecurities. What happens when part of the mangrove forest is damaged? Danny asked, apparently following a similar train of thought. The healthy sections gradually expand to fill the gaps, Carlos replied, but only if the conditions are right for new growth. If the water becomes too polluted, or the root systems are too damaged, then the forest can't recover naturally. As we continued through the peaceful waterways, observing herons, egrets, and the occasional iguana sunning itself on overhanging branches, I found myself thinking about organizational ecology and the conditions necessary for healthy workplace environments to thrive. Summit Strategic Solutions had the potential to be a vibrant, collaborative ecosystem, where talented consultants could develop their skills while delivering excellent results for clients. But Rick's toxic management style was like pollution in the system, preventing natural growth and resilience from developing. My confrontation with Rick might be the beginning of a detoxification process, but real change would require more systemic intervention than one employee setting boundaries. It would require leadership commitment to healthy management practices, clear policies about work-life balance, and accountability systems that prevented abusive behavior from being rewarded or ignored. By the time we returned from our mangrove exploration, I'd made a decision that surprised me with its clarity and conviction. I wasn't just going to set better boundaries with Rick Thompson. I was going to document his behavior patterns, research my options for addressing workplace harassment, and develop a comprehensive strategy for protecting myself and potentially other employees from his manipulative tactics. If Summit Strategic Solutions wanted to retain talented consultants and maintain its reputation for excellence, then it needed to address the toxic management practices that were driving people away. If the company wasn't willing to make those changes, then I would take my skills and client relationships somewhere that valued ethical leadership and employee well-being. Either way, Rick Thompson's days of controlling my personal life were permanently over. The remaining 8 days of our honeymoon passed like a dream I never wanted to wake up from. Danny and I settled into a rhythm that felt both luxurious and natural, morning swims in the warm Pacific waters. Afternoon explorations of hidden beaches, accessible only by hiking through dense jungle trails, and evenings spent on our cabin's private deck watching spectacular sunsets paint the sky in colors that seemed too vivid to be real. I kept my phone in airplane mode for the entire week, checking it only once daily to ensure no genuine family emergencies required attention. Each day without Rick's intrusions felt like reclaiming another piece of myself I'd forgotten existed. The woman who laughed spontaneously at Danny's terrible jokes, who spent hours photographing exotic birds without checking the time, who could have philosophical conversations about life goals without feeling guilty about neglecting work responsibilities. On our final morning in Costa Rica, as we packed our belongings and prepared to return to reality, Danny sat on the edge of our bed, watching me fold clothes with unusual care and attention to detail. "You're different," he observed quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of amazement and deep affection. "I mean, you're still you, but you're more yourself than you've been in years." I paused in my packing to consider his words. He was right. Somewhere between confronting Rick's manipulation and spending a week completely disconnected from Summit Strategic Solutions, I'd rediscovered parts of my personality that had been buried under layers of professional anxiety and people-pleasing behavior. I feel like I've been holding my breath for 3 years, I admitted, sitting beside him on the bed. Like I was so afraid of disappointing Rick or losing client approval that I forgot what it felt like to just exist without constantly performing. Danny took my hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles across my palm. What are you going to do when we get back? Are you ready to face whatever chaos Rick has created in your absence? The question I'd been avoiding finally demanded attention. Our return flight would land in Portland Sunday evening, and I was expected back at Summit Strategic Solutions Monday morning. By now Rick had probably escalated his fictional crisis to impressive heights, possibly involving Patricia Williams, client complaints, and dramatic narratives about my abandonment of professional responsibilities. I'm going to document everything, I said, surprising myself with the decisiveness in my voice. Every manipulative phone call, every fabricated emergency, every attempt to violate boundaries I've clearly established. Then I'm going to present the pattern to Patricia and let her decide whether Rick's management style aligns with the company's values. And if she doesn't take action, then I'll know Summit Strategic Solutions isn't the kind of place where I want to build my career, I replied simply. I have options, Danny. Good options. I don't have to tolerate toxic management just because I'm afraid of change. The flight back to Portland felt like traveling between different universes. As our plane descended through the familiar Pacific Northwest cloud cover, I could see the city's lights twinkling below like a constellation of obligations and expectations. The contrast with Costa Rica's natural rhythms and unhurried pace was jarring, but not overwhelming. I wasn't the same person who had left Portland 2 weeks ago. Sunday evening at home felt strange and transitional. Our apartment, which had seemed perfectly comfortable before the honeymoon, now felt cramped and sterile compared to the open-air cabin where we'd been living. The constant hum of traffic and urban activity seemed harsh after days of listening to ocean waves and tropical birds. I turned my phone back to normal mode, for the first time in over a week, and watched as notifications flooded the screen. 17 missed calls from Rick, 34 text messages, ranging from urgent to furious, to pleading, and 12 emails with increasingly dramatic subject lines. The volume of attempted communication was actually impressive in its desperation. Instead of feeling anxious about the backlog of Rick's demands, I felt something closer to anthropological curiosity. His messages provided a fascinating case study in escalating manipulation tactics when the target refuses to respond according to established patterns. The early messages had followed his usual formula of manufactured urgency combined with appeals to my professional dedication. But as days passed without response, his tone had shifted through several distinct phases: frustrated authority figure, demanding compliance; wounded mentor expressing disappointment in my betrayal; desperate manager, pleading for assistance with supposedly catastrophic situations. The most recent messages revealed a man who had completely lost control of his carefully constructed narrative. His final email, sent Saturday afternoon, was a barely coherent rant about my unprofessional behavior, the damage I was causing to client relationships, and his plans to recommend my termination for abandoning my responsibilities. This is actually perfect, I told Danny, as I scrolled through the evidence of Rick's psychological meltdown. He's documented his own pattern of harassment and shown exactly why his management style is problematic. Monday morning arrived with typical Portland drizzle, the kind of gentle precipitation that locals barely noticed but newcomers found depressing. I dressed carefully for my return to Summit Strategic Solutions, choosing an outfit that projected confidence and professionalism rather than defensiveness or apology. I wasn't returning as a chastened employee seeking forgiveness for prioritizing my honeymoon. I was returning as a valued consultant, ready to address workplace harassment issues that had been allowed to persist too long. The Summit Strategic Solutions office felt smaller than I remembered, its glass-walled conference rooms and open workspace layout somehow less impressive after experiencing Costa Rica's vast natural spaces. My colleagues greeted me with warm smiles and genuine enthusiasm about the honeymoon photos I'd shared on social media, their reactions suggesting that Rick's supposed crisis hadn't created the widespread panic he'd claimed. Jessica Kim practically bounced over to my desk with a steaming coffee cup and eager questions about the ziplining adventures and wildlife encounters I'd posted about. Her relaxed demeanor provided immediate confirmation that the Morrison Tech situation hadn't evolved into the company
Threatening emergency Rick had described. How was the supposed client crisis while I was gone? I asked casually, testing whether Jessica was aware of any actual problems. What client crisis? Jessica replied with genuine puzzlement. Morrison Tech sent a really nice email last Tuesday praising the progress on their project implementation. Dave Morrison specifically mentioned how well the new protocols were working and thanked the team for the smooth transition process. The revelation that Morrison Tech had actually praised the project's progress while Rick was claiming they were threatening contract termination confirmed the extent of his deception. He hadn't just exaggerated routine client concerns, he'd invented a crisis that was the complete opposite of reality. Did Rick seem stressed about anything last week? I pressed, curious about his behavior when his manipulation tactics failed to produce results. He was definitely wound up about something, Jessica admitted. He kept calling emergency team meetings to discuss client satisfaction strategies, but nobody could figure out what specific problem he was trying to address. Marcus finally asked him directly what was wrong, and Rick just said he was implementing proactive communication protocols. Marcus Johnson appeared at my desk a few minutes later, looking relieved and slightly guilty about the supposed Morrison Tech disaster that had triggered Rick's campaign to interrupt my honeymoon. "Emma, I owe you an apology," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure Rick wasn't within hearing distance. "After you left, I reviewed my notes from the Morrison meeting and realized I may have overstated Dave's concerns when I briefed Rick. Dave seemed completely satisfied with the project progress when I followed up later in the week." "What do you mean you overstated his concerns?" I asked, though I suspected Marcus had been manipulated rather than deliberately deceptive. Rick asked very specific questions about any negative feedback or concerns Dave might have expressed, Marcus explained. When I mentioned that Dave had asked about timeline adjustments for the final implementation phase, Rick interpreted that as major dissatisfaction and kept pressing for more details about problems that weren't really problems. The picture of Rick's manipulation became even clearer. He'd taken Marcus's routine client feedback, twisted it into evidence of serious concerns, then used his manufactured crisis to justify harassing me during my honeymoon. The sophistication of his deception was almost impressive in its calculated cynicism. I spent the morning catching up on legitimate work issues, reviewing project updates, and reconnecting with clients who had genuinely missed my input during the 2-week absence. The Morrison Tech situation was proceeding smoothly under Marcus's capable management, with no signs of the catastrophic relationship breakdown Rick had described. Rick himself remained conspicuously absent from the office floor, though I could see his office light was on and his door was firmly closed. Through the glass walls, I occasionally caught glimpses of him on phone calls that seemed intense and private. Whether he was trying to manufacture actual client crises to justify his previous lies or preparing for the confrontation he knew was coming, I couldn't tell. Patricia Williams appeared at my desk just before lunch, her warm smile and maternal energy providing a welcome contrast to the tension I could feel radiating from Rick's corner office. "Welcome back, dear," Patricia said genuinely. "I hope you and Danny had a wonderful time in Costa Rica. The photos you shared looked absolutely magical." "It was perfect," I replied honestly. "Exactly what we both needed after the wedding stress and work pressure." Patricia's expression shifted slightly, becoming more serious and focused. "I'd like to schedule some time this afternoon to discuss the situation with Rick Thompson. I've received some concerning information about communication patterns during your absence, and I think we need to address workplace boundary issues before they become more problematic." The fact that Patricia was initiating the conversation rather than waiting for me to file a complaint suggested that Rick's behavior had attracted attention from multiple sources. Perhaps other employees had finally felt comfortable reporting his manipulative tactics, or maybe his increasingly erratic behavior during my absence had raised red flags with senior leadership. "I'd welcome that conversation," I said carefully. "I think there are some patterns that need examination." 3 o'clock in my office, Patricia confirmed. "And Emma, don't worry about any professional consequences for maintaining your honeymoon boundaries. That was exactly the right decision, and I'm proud of you for prioritizing your marriage."
The afternoon meeting with Patricia took place in her corner office, a space that reflected both her business acumen and her commitment to employee welfare. The walls displayed Summit Strategic Solutions client success stories alongside personal photos of Patricia's family and community involvement activities. I'd prepared carefully for this conversation, organizing my documentation of Rick's behavior patterns into a clear chronological narrative that demonstrated escalating boundary violations over the past 18 months. The evidence was compelling: emails sent at inappropriate hours with demands for immediate response, manufactured urgencies that required personal time sacrifices, and most recently, the fabricated Morrison tech crisis designed to interrupt my honeymoon. Patricia listened with growing concern as I presented the pattern of manipulation and control that had characterized Rick's management style. She took notes, asked clarifying questions, and occasionally shook her head in apparent disappointment at the behavior I was describing. I had no idea the situation had become this problematic. Patricia said when I finished my presentation. Rick's quarterly reports have consistently emphasized team productivity and client satisfaction, but he's never mentioned the personal costs his management style was imposing on employees. I think I may not be the only person affected, I said carefully. Several talented consultants have left the company over the past 2 years, often citing work-life balance concerns or desire for new challenges. It might be worth investigating whether Rick's management approach contributed to that turnover. Patricia made additional notes and promised to conduct discreet interviews with current and former employees to assess the scope of the problem. She also confirmed that Rick's account of the Morrison tech situation had been completely fabricated, as client feedback indicated high satisfaction with project progress throughout the period when he was claiming catastrophic relationship problems. "What outcome are you hoping for from this conversation?" Patricia asked directly. I'd anticipated this question and prepared a thoughtful response that balanced accountability with organizational healing. I want Rick to receive professional development support that helps him understand appropriate management boundaries. I want clear policies established that protect employees from harassment during approved personal time. And I want assurance that speaking up about these issues won't result in professional retaliation. Those are all reasonable expectations, Patricia agreed. I'm also considering whether Rick's current role aligns with his demonstrated management capabilities. The operations director position requires someone who can build team trust and maintain client relationships without creating toxic workplace dynamics. The implication that Rick might face significant professional consequences for his behavior was both satisfying and slightly uncomfortable. I'd wanted accountability and change, but I wasn't seeking revenge or trying to destroy his career. I just wanted to work in an environment where personal boundaries were respected and manipulation wasn't disguised as mentorship. "There's one more thing," I said as our meeting concluded. "I've been thinking about my own career development, and I'm interested in exploring opportunities for greater independence in my consulting practice. Not necessarily leaving Summit immediately, but developing skills and client relationships that would support eventual entrepreneurship." Patricia's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "That's exactly the kind of ambitious thinking I love to see. What if we discussed creating a consultant track that allows for more autonomy and client ownership while maintaining your connection to Summit's resources and support systems?" The possibility of maintaining my Summit Strategic Solutions affiliation while building toward independent practice felt like the perfect compromise. I could continue serving existing clients and developing new relationships while gradually establishing the foundation for my own consulting firm. Over the following weeks, the transformation at Summit Strategic Solutions was swift and comprehensive. Patricia's investigation confirmed that Rick's manipulative management style had affected multiple employees, contributing to higher than normal turnover and creating an atmosphere of anxiety that undermined team effectiveness. Rick was placed on administrative leave pending completion of a formal review process that would determine his future with the company. In his absence, team productivity actually improved as consultants felt empowered to manage their own time and client relationships without constant oversight and manufactured urgencies. The Morrison Tech project concluded successfully ahead of schedule, with Dave Morrison specifically praising the team's professionalism and recommending Summit Strategic Solutions to 2 other companies in his network. The supposed crisis that Rick had used to justify interrupting my honeymoon proved to be one of our most successful client outcomes of the year. Patricia implemented new workplace policies that established clear boundaries around after-hours communication, vacation time protection, and employee rights to disconnect from work during approved personal time. The changes were welcomed enthusiastically by staff who had been struggling with similar boundary issues but felt unable to address them individually. My own role evolved into something approaching ideal professional conditions. Patricia created a senior consultant position that allowed me significant autonomy in project management while providing support for business development activities that would eventually support independent practice. I began building relationships with potential clients who specifically sought consulting services that prioritize sustainable workplace cultures and employee well-being. 6 months after returning from my honeymoon, I was invited to speak at the Pacific Northwest Business Leadership Conference about organizational change management and the importance of ethical workplace cultures. The presentation drew enthusiastic response from business leaders who were struggling with similar issues in their own organizations. Among the audience members was Jennifer Morrison from the Berkeley consulting firm I'd met at the San Francisco conference. She approached me afterward with a proposition that would change everything. "Emma, I've been following your work at Summit, and I'm impressed by the changes you've helped implement there," Jennifer said during the conference networking session. "My partners and I are looking to expand our Portland presence, and we think your approach to consulting would be perfect for our client base." The offer was compelling, a partnership track with an established firm that shared my values around work-life balance and ethical client relationships. The financial terms were generous, the client base was exactly aligned with my interests, and the company culture emphasized collaboration over competition. But as Jennifer outlined the opportunity, I realized that my goals had evolved beyond finding the perfect employer. The experience of confronting Rick's manipulation and advocating for workplace change had awakened something entrepreneurial and independent that couldn't be satisfied by even the most attractive employment arrangement. "I'm honored by the offer," I told Jennifer honestly, "but I think I'm ready to build something completely my own. What I'd love to explore is a strategic partnership where our firms could collaborate on larger projects while maintaining our independent identities." Jennifer's eyes lit up with interest. "Now that's an intriguing proposition. Tell me more about your vision." By the end of the conference, Jennifer and I had outlined a partnership framework that would allow my future consulting practice to collaborate with her established firm while maintaining complete autonomy over client relationships and business decisions. It was exactly the kind of professional arrangement that honored both independence and collaboration. The conversation with Jennifer crystallized my decision to leave Summit Strategic Solutions and establish Rodriguez Consulting Group. Patricia was supportive of the transition, even offering to serve as a reference and potential collaborator for future projects that required larger consulting teams. "You've grown into exactly the kind of business leader I hoped you'd become when I first hired you," Patricia said during our final meeting. "I'm proud of the way you handled the Rick situation, and I'm excited to see what you build independently." Rick Thompson never returned to Summit Strategic Solutions. The investigation into his management practices revealed a pattern of behavior that extended back several years and affected numerous employees. He accepted a severance package that included professional coaching requirements and a commitment to addressing the leadership issues that had made his management style problematic. I felt no satisfaction in Rick's professional consequences, but I was relieved that other employees would be protected from the manipulation and boundary violations that had characterized his approach to management. The changes at Summit created a healthier workplace culture that supported employee success rather than exploiting dedication and ambition. Rodriguez Consulting Group launched 9 months after my honeymoon confrontation with Rick, with 3 major clients who had specifically requested to work with me independently. The firm's mission statement emphasized sustainable business practices, ethical workplace cultures, and consulting relationships built on mutual respect rather than dependency. Danny supported the entrepreneurial transition with characteristic patience and practical wisdom, helping me navigate the financial challenges of startup costs while maintaining enthusiasm for the long-term vision. His perspective as an educator provided valuable insights into organizational development and change management that enhanced my consulting methodology. Our first major project involved helping a growing technology company scale their operations while maintaining the collaborative culture that had driven their initial success. The work was exactly what I'd dreamed of doing, solving complex organizational challenges while supporting employee well-being and sustainable business practices. As I presented final recommendations to the technology company's leadership team, I reflected on how different this experience felt from my work at Summit Strategic Solutions. Instead of manipulative urgency and artificial crises, there was genuine collaboration and mutual respect. Instead of sacrificing personal boundaries for professional advancement, I was building a practice that honored both excellence and humanity. The client CEO's feedback captured everything I'd hoped to achieve. Working with Rodriguez Consulting Group has been transformative not just for our operational efficiency, but for our understanding of what healthy organizational growth looks like. Emma's approach helped us scale successfully while actually improving our workplace culture. 2 years after that manipulative phone call in the Costa Rican rainforest, I was signing contracts to acquire Summit Strategic Solutions' client portfolio and intellectual property. Patricia Williams had decided to retire, and the board of directors had approached me about purchasing the company's assets rather than seeking an external buyer. The irony was delicious and perfectly appropriate. The company where Rick Thompson had tried to control my personal life was now becoming part of my independent consulting practice. The clients he'd claimed couldn't function without his direct oversight were thriving under my collaborative approach to project management. It feels like coming full circle, Danny observed as we reviewed the acquisition documents in our home office, which had expanded to accommodate my growing consulting practice. More like spiral than circle, I corrected, thinking about the growth and change that had brought me to this moment. I'm returning to the same clients and projects, but as a completely different person with completely different values and boundaries. The acquisition of Summit Strategic Solutions was finalized on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 3 years after Rick's honeymoon phone call had triggered my journey toward independence and self-advocacy. The combined client base of Rodriguez Consulting Group and Summit's portfolio created one of the most respected consulting practices in the Pacific Northwest. My first decision as the new owner was implementing even stronger workplace protection policies, including a formal commitment that employees would never be contacted during approved vacation time except for genuine life-threatening emergencies. The policy was named the Honeymoon Protection Protocol in honor of the experience that had taught me the importance of defending personal boundaries. The success of Rodriguez Consulting Group attracted attention from business publications and professional development organizations interested in sustainable consulting practices and ethical workplace cultures. I was invited to speak at conferences, contribute to industry publications, and mentor other professionals who were building practices that prioritized both excellence and humanity. Each speaking engagement and mentoring conversation reinforced my conviction that Rick Thompson's approach to management was not just personally destructive but professionally counterproductive. Organizations that supported employee well-being consistently achieved better client outcomes, higher retention rates, and more sustainable growth than those that prioritized control and manipulation. The Costa Rican rainforest had taught me about ecosystem health and the importance of diversity and collaboration in creating resilient natural communities. Building Rodriguez Consulting Group taught me that the same principles applied to business organizations and professional relationships. 3 years after hanging up on Rick Thompson while howler monkeys called in the distance, I was standing in my own conference room presenting a strategic plan to help another consulting firm address toxic management issues that were undermining their success. The client situation was eerily similar to what I'd experienced at Summit, and I was able to provide both professional expertise and personal insight into creating healthier workplace dynamics. The most important thing to understand, I told the client leadership team, is that manipulation and control create short-term compliance but long-term dysfunction. Sustainable success requires building systems that support employee autonomy while maintaining accountability for results. As I outlined recommendations for policy changes, management training, and cultural transformation, I thought about the journey that had brought me from Costa Rican victim of workplace harassment to respected expert on organizational health and employee advocacy. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate, but it had been profoundly worthwhile. Standing up to Rick's manipulation had required courage I wasn't sure I possessed, but finding that courage had opened possibilities I'd never imagined when I was accepting his boundary violations as normal corporate culture. Danny and I returned to Costa Rica for our 5th wedding anniversary, staying at the same eco lodge where I'd received Rick's manipulative phone call years earlier. The cabin looked exactly the same, with screened windows open to the rainforest and the sound of howler monkeys providing their prehistoric soundtrack. But everything else had changed. Instead of anxiety about work obligations and fear of professional consequences, I felt deep satisfaction about the consulting practice I'd built and the positive impact it was having on clients and employees throughout the region. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd given in to Rick's demands that morning? Danny asked as we sat on the deck watching sunset paint the Pacific Ocean in brilliant colors. Sometimes, I admitted, but I think I would have eventually reached a breaking point anyway. Rick's behavior was escalating, and I was becoming increasingly miserable. The honeymoon confrontation just accelerated a process that was probably inevitable. I'm glad it happened when it did, Danny said, taking my hand as we watched the sun disappear below the horizon. I'm proud of the woman you've become and the business you've built. As tropical darkness settled around us and the rainforest began its evening symphony, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. Rick Thompson's attempt to control my personal life had ultimately liberated me from toxic workplace dynamics and launched me toward professional independence. I'd never had the courage to pursue without that catalyst. Sometimes the worst professional betrayals create the best opportunities for growth and transformation. By forcing me to choose between my marriage and his manipulative demands, Rick had inadvertently shown me exactly how much I was capable of achieving when I stopped allowing fear and people-pleasing to limit my potential. The howler monkeys called out from the canopy above us, their voices carrying across the same rainforest where I'd first found the courage to say no to workplace harassment. Their calls sounded like celebration, welcoming me back to the place where I'd learned that personal boundaries aren't selfish limitations but essential foundations for building a life of meaning and integrity. Rodriguez Consulting Group now employs 12 consultants and serves clients across 3 states, all operating under policies that prioritize both professional excellence and human dignity. We've never had a single employee quit due to work-life balance issues, and our client satisfaction rates consistently exceed industry averages. The success proves that Rick Thompson's management approach wasn't just ethically wrong but practically ineffective. Building a consulting practice based on respect, collaboration, and sustainable workplace practices created better outcomes for everyone involved: employees, clients, and the business itself. Every time I sign a new client contract or celebrate another team member's professional milestone, I think about that phone call in the Costa Rican rainforest, and the moment I finally found the courage to prioritize my own well-being over someone else's need for control. The best revenge against workplace manipulation isn't retaliation or bitterness, but building something better, something that proves toxic management practices aren't necessary for professional success. Rodriguez Consulting Group stands as evidence that businesses can thrive while honoring employee humanity and personal boundaries. Rick Thompson tried to own my time, my energy, and my priorities. Instead, he inadvertently taught me to own my power, my boundaries, and my professional destiny. Sometimes the people who try to hold you back end up showing you exactly how high you're capable of flying. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.